Hi, Misha here, and for actually a number of years, I have been wanting to get one more FAL for the collection. And could this be it? And at first, this might seem like a bit of an unusual choice for me. This is the DS Arms, DSA, SA58 Tactical Carbine. I've also seen it referred to as the lightweight. So why this gun? Why am I considering it? Where did it come from? And what are we going to do with it? I thought that'd be a good topic for this video. First though, I did that long Japanese collection video last time, My Happy Place, and in that I mentioned I had a deal for you. If you would watch, comment, like on it, I would do another long video on the AR-15 and on the FAL. Several people seem to like that idea. So over on Patreon, which you can go to the link in the description to, I'm going to do a poll and ask the Patreons, which one do they want to see first, the FAL video or the AR-15? So check that out. And if you can't support on Patreon, that's cool. Liking, subscribing, and definitely sharing also help. So with that, let's begin with what this is and what it ships with. Let's begin with what it ships with. You get a 20-round plastic mag. Reminds me of a thermal mag. Maybe actually thermal, although it is DSA labeled. It does come with a PMag style top. Of course, it is very different for 7.62 NATO, holds 20 rounds, metric style. As you can see here, it's a mag. I have quite a few original metrics, and I somewhere around here have some of the DSA metal ones, but I'm not going to dig them out for this. So, magazine is pretty unimpressive, although I guess it does kind of go to the lightweight. Something we don't always get today, it comes with a manual. It's actually a nicely bound manual too. Kind of reminds me of a SIG manual. And page 24 might be of a particular interest because that's where it tells you how to adjust the gas system. And finally, something that doesn't ship a lot today, we actually get a sling. Is it a cheap sling? Sure. But it is wide. It even has some kind of rubber coating here for non-stick. It's adjustable. It works. And it attaches in front to a Uncle Mike's type sling swivel on a stud. And it does all ship in a cheap but still usable hard carry case, which again, these accessories aren't special in and of themselves, but considering a lot of guns today ship with one mag and a cardboard box and nothing much else, it's a little bit extra. So with that, what about the SA58 Tactical itself? I will say the mag pops in fine. It's certainly not loose at all. Although you'd think as the polymer wears it will get bit. But oh well. So, what do we have here? Starting with the barrel. This is a 16.25, so I think it's around 413 millimeters. So-called premium mid-weight fluted barrel. I know some reports say it is not chrome-lined chamber or bore, but according to DSA's website, it is chrome-lined. Take it as you will. Even though early guns seem to have a 1 in 11 twist, according to the DSA website again, this is a 1 in 10 twist, which I've been seeing more and more with newer guns. And it's supposedly 4150 steel. So, take it as you will. One change they've made, and we'll get into DSA a lot more in depth. Originally, metric FALs would be threaded 13mm. This has a much more useful 5/8 by 24 thread, and it comes capped with their DSA Wars, whatever, flash hider. It's a birdcage style. I kind of like it though. It is also lightweight. It's very thin walled, if you can see my finger here. Moving back, we have a pretty standard gas plug, gas system. But then we have something unique. We have a carbine length gas system handguard, which we'll look at in detail later. It's kind of interesting. It does save quite a bit of weight. That's why we don't have a traditional front sling swivel or cut for a bipod, although it does crack me up that the short handguards are bipod cut. I would imagine they use the same basic mold and just trim them as needed. It does have the short closed ear front sight base. I do actually kind of like how they've done the sling swivel, so you can completely take it off and continue to save weight if you don't need it. These are kind of more modern glass-filled polymer. DSA claims they updated the traditional, and they have 3 smaller vent slots, and then they have 2, I believe it's 2, yeah, 2 round holes on the bottom. Like I said, moving back, we have a metric magwell. This is the standard version, not the more deluxe one, so it has standard bolt release and mag release, which I'm fine with. Standard safety, moves well. Standard top cover, and standard non-reciprocating left side cocking handle, charging handle. The pistol grip is the DSA type that's hollow. Again, saving on weight. That's just how they do them too. Now moving back here. Now this gun I didn't order from DSA. A friend actually had it in his gun shop, new, and I thought, I really just want a new FAL, and I've never owned a carbine length lightweight gun. Now I would think to do this as a paratrooper, and I still might. You can convert these, although it's not straightforward as you might hope. But the one he had has the traditional DSA stock and adjustable low rear sight. The paratroopers typically have a protected flip 250, 150 meter rear sight. At first, I thought, well, I could always put the para on here or trade this one off and get a para version. I still might do that if I like how it shoots, but there is one advantage to this setup. Even though it is a little bit longer, you know, it is lighter. The traditional paratrooper stock, the whole assembly, does add a slight bit of weight compared with the fixed stock, although DSA does have a modern polymer version that might save some weight. So, with that said, what about the receiver? Well, let's talk about it. Looking on this side, you can see that it is clearly Type 1 with lightning cuts here. It also has the Type 1 style. This is a non-carry handle cut, kind of going with the lightweight theme. And flipping her over, you see the same corresponding lightning cut here. I do notice that it's more rounded on the bottom as it meets the lower. And then, of course, we have the major lightning cut on the magwell. So this is clearly a Type 1 receiver. The question, is it forged, machined, or is it investment cast and then machined into final shape? Well, the commonly accepted belief is if it's a DS prefix serial, it is a forged, and if it's a DSA prefix serial, it's an investment cast. So, by rights, this should be a casting. So that actually, to my mind, makes it interesting, because I've never had a cast DSA 50,000 serial range. I have had cast Kunin, cast Hess, even cast FN. I will say, like down here where the barrel goes, this is much smoother than the old Kunin, the DCIs, and just about anything smoother than the old Hess. Interestingly though, when you have a cast FN, it's always going to be a Type 3 or Type 4 if you prefer. But DSA is doing Type 1s. So that actually kind of adds to it. First impressions though, if it's cast, it's a smooth casting. I don't see any inclusions. It has all the appropriate lightning cuts. it seems fine. So yeah, that's the receiver, what some people call the upper receiver. This isn't really a receiver, even though sometimes it's called a lower receiver. Either way, it's not the gun part. I've often seen it as the trigger frame. With the upper, the receiver, the gun part out of the way, what about the lower? I was hoping it would be, and it is, the aluminum, the lightweight alloy lower. I believe this is a 7150 T6 aircraft. It is machined from a block, and as we'll discuss later in the video, this lightweight lower was actually pioneered by FN with the model 5064. So I like it. It does actually combine with the shorter fluted barrel and short gas system, make this thing balance very well. That's why I'm not sure if I want to do a folding stock, because the balance point with this polymer stock is really nice. And the overall dimensions and weight are kind of interesting to me. Your standard fixed stock 21-inch traditional FAL is around 9.5 pounds unloaded, but that can quickly get up to 10.5 pounds depending on the variant, and even bump 11, and that's not even counting the heavy barrel and the paras. Again, some of the paras can actually be slightly heavier, just depending on how they are, although the short barrel paras do knock that back down to 9 pounds again. This thing weighs in just over 8 pounds unloaded, no mag. Even with the mag in it, according to my postal scale, we're only about 8.25 pounds. And again, that's thanks to the fluted 16-inch barrel, medium profile, the quite lightweight muzzle device, lacking the sling swivel. The short gas system really does save weight, even though it does kind of make the barrel look a little strange. The lower helps, and the buttstock. And it being a Type 1 versus a Type 3 receiver helps as well. So I really think the weight is quite interesting. Overall length is also quite interesting. This is about 36.5 inches long. A traditional paratrooper, if you go as short as possible, well, I'll say this, a 21-inch fixed stock gun is just over 43 inches. So, not bad. The shorter version of the paratrooper, the 5063, is around 39.25 to 39.5 inches, depending on the exact muzzle device installed. That would be the one that has the 17.25 inch barrel, so about an inch longer barrel. So this is still shorter. That's, of course, with the paratrooper's stock deployed. If you fold the stock, it's about 29.5 inches. So, yeah. Now, the 21-inch paratrooper, it's about 33.5 inches with the stock folded. So, a little bit shorter, but not by much compared with this. And the FAL folding stock, I like it, but it's certainly not as comfortable to shoot with as a fixed stock. And the folding mechanism for the FN has the lock on it. Luckily, the DSA version does not, which makes it maybe a little less sturdy, but also so much easier to get into place. So this is really quite short. Although this is, of course, a semi-automatic civilian version, DSA does offer the short gas system combined with an 11-inch barrel, roughly a 280 millimeter, or a 13-inch barrel, roughly a 330 millimeter. And those are typically in the OSW, the SA58 OSW range. Basically special forces. They can be had as either semi or semi-full auto versions. Because DSA is trying, or at least has tried in years past, to modernize the FAL, because they are actually the only really manufacturer in the world left. They also have some versions, the SA58 SPR, SA58 DMR, and the SA58 CTC. We'll get to those later. But let's talk about them being the remaining manufacturer and why I consider them legit. In fact, even though the majority of my FAL collection are imports, when it comes to guns that are kit built, because sometimes you just have to kit build a gun because there was never a semi-auto import, I've always went with DSA receivers. But that was in the past. That was back in the days of LMT. What about today? Well, part of the fun of this, when we take it to the range, which we definitely will a new production DSA trick me out, tickle my fancy, or will I find it to be meh compared to the ones that have come before? Well, with that, let's talk DSA, where they started, what's going on. The DS in DSA, or DS Arms, stands for its founder and, I believe, still president, Dave Salvaggio. And when he started the company, he already dabbled in the FAL game, beginning in the early 90s, right around the transition from pre-ban to post-ban era. Again, the executive order signed by then President Bush, March 1989. It had a bit of an interesting transition period running through November of 1990. And this might not be the gun you think of when you think of DSA. Argentine, FAMAP, FMAP, FAL, FSL, SLR. It had a few names. But this is, kind of one of the earliest reported records. Now, this one is an actual pre-ban. Arms Corps was one of the earliest importers. Argentina introduced the FAL in 1982. Arms Corps, National Arms, and Belli imported some in the 80s, but actually in quite small numbers before the 89 ban. For more on that, we'll get to the big FAL video. But when the 89 ban hammer came down, there were quite a few caught in customs, and this is where DSA will step in. Some importers, namely Springfield, got around the ban by bringing over the SA5800. They had imported the SA58 from Brazil, manufactured by Imbel before the ban. The 4800 came in post-ban from 1990 to 1996 and featured a thumbhole stock and essentially no flashlight or bayonet lug, or bayonet notch, I should say, because that's how FALs work. It's under here. Other companies like Century also worked with Imbel receivers and others. They did their L1A1 Sporter, later their R1A1 Sporter, and they essentially had guns assembled on Imbel receivers up in Canada using Brit and Aussie parts, and brought them in as thumbhole stock guns again. So there were ways around. Now the Argentine guns, the FMAPs, they took a different avenue, and this is where DSA comes in. Pop the mag out to show you the flange of the mag well here. If you have a gun marked SAC-LATA, SAC, which is Southern Ammunition Corporation, they imported essentially the guns, or the uppers anyway, and what they basically did, they split them up. They would have the upper, the barrel, the upper receiver, which is the gun part, sold separately. And then there would be a kit, essentially the lower and other parts, sold. And this is a way to get around the ban at the time. Because you weren't selling a gun, you were selling two completely different pieces from two completely different companies. And if someone were to buy them and recombine them, who cares? This is why a lot of the post-ban FSLs, or LSRs, don't have matching numbers. Even though they're just as good quality, even though they're factory guns, yeah. And this is where DSA steps in. In 1993, they sold around 1,000 of these uppers. And the other parts, the parts kits part, were sold by A&D Global. At least they were one of the companies that sold them. And in 1994, this expanded. They brought in 3,000, maybe 4,000 more. So this is DSA getting involved in the game. Pretty neat. Unfortunately, for a long time, these Argentinian guns were not as appreciated. But I love them, and now they're starting to really kind of get their due. Again, for more on these, we'll talk about the big video. But I just wanted to mention them because that's where DSA really got their start, aside from just, parts kits and other things. Around the same time period, though, a European country was looking to offload a bunch of FAL stuff. Parts, blueprints, tooling, machinery even. Essentially the whole kit and caboodle. And this is why DSA is pretty darn legit. At least it was early on. And thus we come to Steyr GmbH and the STG58. And my first kit build, well, not my first one, but actually, yeah, the first gun FAL I assembled was an STG58 because the kits were really nice and, well, they were a little more expensive. It was worth it. But this is my kit build on a DSA. So as it happens, type 2 receiver, carry handle cut. Yeah. And the deal was, Steyr in Austria wanted to get rid of the production line. You see, in 1977, they switched over to this little-known gun called the AUG, the basically Army Universal Rifle. I love the AUG. Story for another day, though. So the FAL production line, the STG production line, had been dormant since the late 70s, at most early 80s. The Austrian FAL was adopted in 1958 and was essentially a variation of this guy, the G1, the Gewehr 1. You see, in 1955, West Germany was was permitted and did have a military gun, the Bundeswehr. They were organized. They needed a gun, hence the G1, which started off as the BGS guns, which were very kind of standard metric FALs, but adjustments would be made, namely shortening of the rear sights. If you remember that Argentinian gun, it has tall sights, which are easy to recognize because of the open ear blocks. Well, these are short. They also went to a QD barrel system, which is not really relevant for today, metal handguards, and a bipod, and this one's on another DSA receiver. This one's a true Type 1. Of course, that would quickly be replaced in 1959 by the G3, but in 1958, Austria would kind of follow West Germany, adopting a very similar version. The handguards were almost identical. The bipods were the same but improved. The barrel is still 21 inches, but we have a new Stoll flash hider, which was actually developed in Austria. And originally they had wood buttstocks, similar to these, but with a rubber butt plate, but soon they would go to the humpless stock made in Austria. The first 20,000 or so were made by FN, but after that they would be made by Steyr, and they would introduce the Type 2 receivers sometimes. They would even have some Type 3s. And they would have the hollow pistol grip, as opposed to the one cut for a storage cleaning kit. Another feature taken from this. Yeah. And they would produce them through the 60s and into the 70s, and I have done a kind of a trace of serial numbers, and they would not really end until about at least 1978. Some sources say even 1981 is a kind of spent up parts. But by the early 90s, they had a bunch of stuff that they didn't need, and DSA started negotiating with them, and I believe around 95 a deal was struck. DSA would take about 40 tons of things from Austria. Like I said, blueprints, machinery, tooling, tons of STG58 parts, some more FN Belgian style parts too. Essentially, the entire production line was kitted up and sold over here for a great deal for DSA and a great deal for Austria, who had no need of it. Post-Cold War, that was the name of the game. Kind of a similar route to how PTR got their HK91/G3 production line. This is why I do consider them legitimate. They get their tooling. They didn't reverse engineer it. Other manufacturers did. Those horrid Hess receivers, which I have worked with, and they can be made to run, believe it or not. And even the Enterprise aren't quite as legitimate, at least early on. They knew what they were doing, they had the specs, and since there were no Austrian STG58 semi-autos ever imported, if you wanted to build one up, the DSA receiver, Type 1 or Type 2, even maybe Type 3, was your best bet. Not just in terms of quality early on, but in terms of authenticity, because these receivers were made to spec. How much so? Well, the earliest receivers, made for at least the first 10,000 receivers, give or take, had the threads cut so much to the original spec that the original barrels would just time. They would just screw in. They were just done. So we've talked about receivers. Let's just do a real quick refresher on the 3, or is it 4 main types. On the top, the DSA Type 1. The original style introduced in the 50s. DSA Type 2. Introduced in 1962. The main difference is just this back here, which reinforced an area when on full auto. Some of the original FN receivers were having stretching and or cracking issues here. Typically this was mostly just done with guns that were used as squad support weapons like the FAL. But the Type 1 and Type 2 were used concurrently, with most production still being Type 1 throughout the 60s. In 1973, FN would introduce the Type 3 here. We're going back to the Argentine import here. They essentially used the same forged block of steel. I think it was 4140, at least the later DSAs would be. And they just didn't do the lightning cuts. They did a real simple cut here on the mag well, the step down, but not the further cut. See here? And there is technically also, according to some, a Type 4. For you see, in 1977, FN, Belgium, first introduced a cast receiver version of the Type 3. Now some say that the Type 4 is actually forged, or can be, and that the difference has to do with the style of lightning cut, like back here on the cocking handle guide and a little bit up here. Either way, some also consider the Type 4 just to be the cast version. Take it as you will. But a little bit different. It's worth pointing out that FN considered the original forged receiver, at least the Type 3, good enough for 80,000 rounds. Go back to the Type 1, that dips down to maybe 60,000 or 50 even, if it's a full auto gun. The Type 2 really helps back here. And they said that the cast receiver, the one they made in Belgium, was good for about 40,000 rounds. These are just what they say. You know, some guns maybe go longer, some guns maybe not as much. Keep in mind, these are 7.62 NATO, 7.62 by 51, 308 guns. So, yeah. That means that most of your Belgian imports in America, certainly the ones from the 80s, are actually cast receiver. Now, earlier ones can be machined, even if they're Type 3. So Type 3 doesn't automatically mean cast. But the Imbel and Rosario FMAP guns, they kept forging theirs. They did never go to casting. So yeah, Type 3, 2, 1. And if you want to say, there's also a Type 4. So that gets us to DSA. And when they introduced the SA58 to the market in 1997. And most of you know why I brought this rifle out. It'd actually be really fun to shoot this sharpshooter alongside this SA58. So yeah, 1997, this first appeared. There were two basic product lines. There was the SA58, which was a Belgian FN FAL 5000 based gun, but also where DSA would jump off and slowly but surely experiment and try to modernize the FAL. There was also the STG58 line, still SA58 marked receivers though, just the invoice said STG58, that was essentially built with surplus parts from Austria, because, you know, they bought a bunch. At this time, the U.S. parts were the barrel, at least on the SA58, the pistol grip, the buttstock, and the trigger group, hammer, sear, disconnector. Some would use a different buttstock, an original, and instead have a U.S. gas piston. So those seem to be the two flex parts, early on anyway. That leaves one more part because you need 7 for the FAL, and that's the receiver, and that's why this Lewis machine and tool today, LMT Defense, is out. As most of you know, I'm sure, the early is kind of loosely used because it was for a good number of years, DSA receivers were machined out by LMT for them. It made sense. DSA was located in Illinois. LMT was located in Illinois. LMT had been in business since 1980, so good relationship there. And DSA could provide the blueprints, the specs, the tooling, and LMT could do the work. They would start off with a 9-pound block of forged 4140 steel and machine it to final shape. Originally, it was a Type 1 receiver with or without the carry handle cut, and they would begin around serial number DS10000. And for a while, those were the two options, although there was a stainless steel version that was made intermittently. And the first guns are actually marked Grace Lake. That's where DSA was out of. Around serial number 14,000, in that era, they would switch to Lake Barrington. That's where DSA would move to. Still LMT receivers, though. And a few thousand serials later, they would start doing Type 2 receivers. And a couple of thousand after that, around serial number 21,000, they would start doing Type 3s. Interestingly, at least originally, the Type 2s were all carry handle cut. I don't know why. Type 3s were with or without. And DSA would continue making them, machining them, I should say. It's said that it took about 8 hours to machine these receivers. That included machining, finishing, heat treating, all that good stuff. And then they would ship the receiver over to DSA, where they would do the assembly. The SA58 line had kind of a paint finish, I believe. I know today it's a Duracoat. I don't know back in the late 90s what it was, but it was a paint finish. The STG58 line, though, actually got a phosphate, a parkerized finish. They call it a matte park, which is interesting, but a lot of the original Austrians were. This one's a blued because it's a earlier one, but this isn't a DSA produced gun because it has the original barrel. And the STG58 had the 21-inch barrel. Because of the metal handguards and bipod, it was about 10 pounds, maybe even a little more, just to get perspective. They would introduce the STG58C, which was a carbine version, had either an 18-inch barrel or a 16 1/4, so same length as this. And the carbine was kind of cool because it had a cut-down stole flash hider. The front was the same where it screws on because this screws on way up here, but they cut this back part off because they had the full-length gas system instead of the carbine, so they didn't really have room for it. No bayonet lugs on these, by the way. These still had the 13 mil threads, too. And that was actually my first DSA gun. I actually did buy an STG58C from them around 2006, maybe? It was post-ban because it did have the Para folding stock, and DSA did offer a folding stock based on the Belgian, but simplified a bit. And so they would offer that in the SA58 line and the STG58 line. There was never an Austrian paratrooper, there was never an Austrian carbine, but they're having fun with it, using up their parts. Although by 2009, 2010, they're getting pretty scant on their original Austrian parts, so the STG58 line kind of goes away, and we see more and more SA58s. And no one is exactly sure how long LMT did the machining for DSA. Some say all the way up to 44,000 serials. Others insist it stopped much earlier, around 30,000 or even into the 20,000s, and that other local machine shops did. But the first several thousand were definitely done by LMT. They would even do a couple of cool special runs. In the early 21st century, DSA started doing kind of a collector's series. They did a clone, a reasonably good one, of the legendary T-48 Trials gun. They also did a run of G1s, for which LMT/DSA made a special run of Type 1 receivers with the G prefixed serials. They also did a special run of South African receivers for the R1. You might think the South African receiver was standard Type 1. It mostly was, but actually the lightning cuts are a little bit different on a South African. And if you look at your lower and how it mates up to a US upper, if you don't have an exact right R1, you can ever so slightly tell. And they did this one. LMT machined some Australian L1, or in my case L2, semi-automatic receivers. Correct lightning cut here. Correct kind of simplified, scooped out inch pattern lightning cut here. Notice how this one is a little more innate, the way they cut it out on the metric. Not so on the inch. If you have a British gun, that looks a little different. There are slight differences between the Aussie and the British lightning cut on the receiver. These are still machined. They even gave these a special AD serial prefix to kind of mimic Australian. The only Aussie pre-bands were the Poyers, although Eden did bring over some just receivers. And I think Onyx might have as well. But there were very few traditional Aussies in America, and the only Brits, the inch guns here, are those LE guns. And these also accepted inch magazines. Notice the larger notch in front compared to a metric. I know most of you know this, but because this is a larger cutout inside, you can actually take a DSA metric receiver and make it take inch mags by machining that out, and metric mags will actually fit in an inch, but very sloppily. It's just not a good idea. But that's kind of getting more into the FAL video. I just wanted to point that out, that this is one of the coolest special runs, and barring finding a Poyer receiver, which bring crazy money, this was a great candidate for building this L2A1 heavy barrel kit on. One of my favorite guns of all times. And you'll definitely be seeing it soon in that big video. So, that was the kind of early years of DSA. And things were going pretty well. And there are always complaints, especially when you're using a bunch of parts. And they were just selling a lot of stripped receivers. It's one thing to buy a gun from a company, but when you buy a receiver, even a good one, you're going to have to do some fitting. Maybe your kit's out of spec or worn. Maybe the receiver's slightly out of spec. Not just DSA. In fact, DSA is one of the better ones. Hess was one of the worst. Enterprise was better. And Kunin, depending on which era, was pretty good. But typically areas like the locking shoulder wouldn't always be completely machined out, but that's okay because you can remove material. You can't add it back. Now sometimes the timing of the barrel could be problematic. Like I said, around serial number 20,000, 22,000, they would tweak the threads to work better with the US barrels being supplied to them at DSA. Interestingly, on a metric gun, you just have to screw your barrel on and hope it times up right. On an inch gun, they actually use a breeching washer so that the barrel can time up. So when you headspace a metric, you just have your locking shoulder. When you headspace an inch, you have two components, locking shoulder and breeching washer. Either way, things were going really well, but around 2012, maybe 2010, maybe as late as 2014, DSA would introduce a cast receiver for the first time. Them using a forged receiver was kind of their claim to fame, but they introduced a cast receiver, and they introduced the Voyager series as an economy line FAL. And of course, at this point, they're the only one really making FALs under original tooling in the world. Interesting. The general rule of thumb from this time period is if you have a DS serial number prefix, it's a forged receiver. Some argue if it's LMT or someone else doing the machine work, but forged. The DSA prefix serials are when they did the cast. Again, casting can be fine. FN did it. Of course, FN is very high quality. But cast gets a bad name because of all the crummy cast receivers made in America, like Hess. But keep in mind, too, other makers like Ruger have done cast receivers for different guns for a very long time. And Springfield has done cast receivers for the M1A, too. Thought I'd point that out. I wanted to mention mags real quick. Here's that metric again. Here's that inch. And I wanted to mention this thermold because it's an interesting hybrid. It has the metric lip, but it has the inch style base. If you notice here, this base goes inside, is very thin, kind of just goes in there and is held in with more or less friction and a little divot. When they went to the inch pattern, which again started off in Canada, they put an actual spring-loaded button here to retain it, and they went to this external lip. It's a much stronger design, as is this much larger locking piece. The downside was these mags won't fit in the metric. And I think it's just really funny this has that. Of course, the reason it does is because it's plastic and it needs all the strength it can get. Very lightweight. FN did actually make alloy mags too, not just steel. DSA also took some Brin mags and converted them for metric use. They would actually add the little divot in the front, and you can tell them because they're slightly curved. They hold 30 rounds. I probably have one around here somewhere that DSA converted, but I'm not going to dig it out. But they're kind of interesting too because they have a base plate, so it's kind of a hybrid design. The Brin mags really weren't made to work. Of course, there's also the L4 mags, which I'm really speaking about, but they can be fitted to inch pattern, although reliability may not be great because of the spring, gravity fed, and they can be machined to work in a metric. This is an actual L2A1 mag, as you see here. Just thought I'd mention it because by this point, DSA is making a ton of FAL parts, and more of its own design, own creation, including like scope mounts and different stocks and different handguards, different muzzle devices, different barrel types, different profiles, and yes, our carbine gas system. So they started off making traditional Belgian/Austrian pattern metric, but by the 2010s, they're really doing their own thing. That's a good segue to get back into today's gun. And here it is again. And here it is with that metric mag. It fits very well, goes in and out very easily, so it doesn't require these thermold or thermold wannabe mags, thank goodness. That would be terrible. And here it is open, just showing that the bolt hold up and works just fine, including releasing. So yeah, no problems there. I haven't tried it with many of my metrics, but I've got a ton of them. It's a good sign when the first two you grab fit and work just fine. Of course, I haven't fired this yet. I don't know. Early on, DSA was like the go-to. But over the last decade or so, they've taken a beating in the FAL community. The thing is, they're really the only game in town. Kunin went out in spectacular fashion. Enterprise is gone. Century hasn't done much FAL stuff. They're really the only thing around. And of course, with their economy series and everything, you hear it. On the other hand, a couple of years ago, they did that run of Israeli kit builds, and reception from those who bought them was pretty good, frankly. We'll see. I'm actually very excited to shoot this. I've shot other carbines, but none quite like this one. And speaking of, let's compare it to my other shorties. First carbine comparison. Here is my Argentinian so-called Congo version. One of my favorite guns, honestly. Good handy size. This has the 18-inch barrel, which was actually trialed out on the 5062 with a folding stock, but because of Belgian paratrooper needs, we ended up with the 63 with the slightly shorter barrel. Standard combo device, standard length handguard and gas system, and these do have the carry handle is standard, and this one has the late style paratrooper 2-position rear sight. But as you see here, the buttstocks, even though this is US made one, very close. Now the pistol grip on this is the kind with the storage compartment in, so it's ever so slightly heavier. Argentine lower, which is slightly different than others, but I digress. But yeah, this is a good way to look at the different lengths of gas system. Notice this one does have the short sights. So this one is overall quite a bit lighter and a little bit shorter. This gun is roughly 40 inches long with this muzzle device and this barrel, and weight-wise is just around 9, maybe slightly more pounds. So a good pound heavier, actually probably about a 9 1/4 because of the Type 3 versus the Type 1. But this was kind of my go-to carbine for a while, but now these are kind of getting collectible, and so that's kind of why I want to show you. Of course, when people think of carbine, they always think of this one. Here is my 5063, or at least the version made in Argentina, Rosario, FAMP, and it has the 17 1/4 inch barrel, but it has still the full-length gas system, although ironically it is actually bipod cut, whereas the Congo is not and has handguards corresponding to it. This is still slightly shorter with the 16-inch barrel and still noticeably lighter. But of course this one has the folding stock, but like I said, this does have a lock on it here, so you have to press down and fold over. Of course, folded up like this, or under 30 inches, so it is half a foot shorter. But it is a little heavier, especially giving more weight in the rear, and even though this has kind of a rubber shrink coating for your cheek, it's just a straight shot, this hump back stock is certainly more comfy. And of course, when you do the folding stock, you have the paratrooper system up here, which puts all of your recoil up here, which makes charging it a little heftier, and it changes things a little bit. Again, note the standard fixed non-reciprocating handle. This has the folding non-reciprocating handle, and while the receiver is cut for a carry handle, it has the donut spacer in it. When you do a paratrooper, you actually do have to have special cuts right up here for the top cover, and of course here for the folding handle, at least for it to work properly. So yeah, a little shorter still, but a little heavier. And this one has the so-called Holland fixed peep rear sight. But we still, of course, have the full-length gas system. Now, I'm not going to take apart the paratrooper. I've done it in videos past. You can look on the channel, and I'm sure I'll do it on the big FAL video in the future. And, of course, I'll talk a lot more about RG production. But I will take a peek inside this gun and use the Congo for comparison. Why not? Let's begin cracking these open. Notice they both have the later style horizontal takedown here. Also the same style of safety. And yeah, taking apart FALs is pretty straightforward. However, not something easily done single-handed while trying to hold a camera. I noticed that there's more of a lightning cut under here versus here. It's a little bit thicker on the RG. Of course, your bolt pulls out we do need to cock our hammer on that one and pull this one out here. Carrier, rat tail, and of course that leads into the spring in the stock. For that paratrooper, there's no rat tail, and instead we have 3 springs nested together in our upper, which makes things more exciting. Sorry, I forgot to have that charged beforehand. So here's our Argentinian bolt group. You know what? I need to look into this. But physically, I was going to say it feels a little lighter. I think it's just how I'm holding it single-handed. I mean, they're both just kind of metric bolt groups. The extractor has changed a few times when it comes to the FAL. You can see this one here. This one here is a bit of an improved, or at least modern design on the extractor, so that's good. Spring-loaded firing pin. Neither one has the sand cuts to the carrier. Both have kind of a phosphate finish. Again, the DSA SA58 has a painted finish. The newer ones are definitely Duracoat, and the RGs have the paint finish, paint over park, which was a copy of the FN. Top covers are, I mean, you can point out tiny differences, but essentially the same as are the trigger groups here. And yes, I know there are small differences in the Argentinian lowers. By the way, Argentina both did a machined and a cast lower too, different times. So that's there, nothing really different. What about the gas system? Let's pull the handguards off. Here's the Congo with its handguard removed. Standard profile barrel. And full-length gas tube. Here's your gas regulator, what the FAL is quite famous for. And now the DSA. And here it is. Notice the barrel continues to be fluted under the handguard, which pleasantly surprised me. The barrel is actually a little bit thicker. It bulges out a bit, but then it's fluted, so that's probably the medium contour they talk about. And notice this has the full-length gas system, and this one is short at the exposed spring here. You might think that's an artifact of them trying to lighten it or it being a carbine. It's not. That's actually because this is based on the Austrian STG-58. All their guns have this short system, and this is actually brazed on to the sight base here, where this is, like most standard FALs, kind of free-floating. So, yeah, although it does, of course, serve the effect of making it lighter. Looking at the handguards, you can see just how much shorter the carbine really is. Of course, this is standard, and this does have the sling swivel stud on it. But there's another difference I've noticed, looking at the other part, has to do with the screw. This one is more or less captive, at least there's a divot here, you have to kind of unscrew it from this. Whereas the one with the DSA is noticeably simplified. It just kind of comes right out, and there's a little bit of a washer there that I just dropped. I knew I was going to do that. Joys of being single-handed, guys. But yeah, small difference there. And again, showing you the length. The US handguards do feel pretty high quality. Now, let's look at the gas system itself. You know how the FAL gas plug comes out. Very easy. Rotate to the right for grenade launching, or at least gas shutoff. To the left for disassembly. There's actually a little difference. This one's a different style. Of course, the STG-58 has its own style too. And then your gas piston and spring pull, well, in theory, pull right on out. There we go. Got a little stuck a bit. Again, here's our tube. Here's our shortened tube. That's the end piece there, end cap. And here they are compared. Yeah, quite a bit longer, both in terms of the piston and the spring for the full size. And DSA says they use stainless steel made pistons. And yeah, it is noticeably lighter. So yeah, those are the differences. What do you think? Well, tell you what, let's get this all put back together, and I'll tell you what I think. First impressions, and tell you what I think about getting it out to the range, and kind of my thoughts on cast receiver modern DSA production. How about that? And back together for final thoughts. Went back together no problem. I will say upper to lower fit is very evenly spaced. Selector moves fine. Trigger is FAL trigger. I really like the quality of the polymer. It feels good. Charging handle's a bit of a slicker plastic. Handguards fit well. And so, why do I want this gun, or at least why am I considering it? Well, for one, I don't have a gun with the alloy lower. I thought that might be kind of fun. Overall, I just like how lightweight it is. Put a different mag in it just to try it out. It fit fine too. I've actually never owned a DSA Carbine length gas system gun. I'm curious how they work. And they're the only ones who's ever really done it. FN never did this length. Again, they mostly did it for their OSW series with the 11 or 13 inch barrel. I do think them changing to the 5/8 by 24 threads was a good idea. And this flash device cracks me up. I like it. And the fluted barrel, even though it's a little bit heavier under the handguard than standard, overall, combined with the gas system, it feels quite a bit lighter. It does feel like a very, very handy gun. Charging the system is fine, no problems there. Installing or moving parts, no problem. I have separated the upper and lower. They come apart, no problem. And at least it comes with a couple of extras, even if they're not great. Well, better than nothing, right? So, of course, that gets down to the receiver and overall DSA's quality. I have 3 US kit-built FALs, and all are on DSA receivers, but all are on the earlier Burlington, or Lake Burlington as it says here, receiver. So, how will this one do? I mean, with a DSA prefix, you would assume it's a cast receiver. And I say assume because when you look on the DSA website now, looking at the 16-inch tactical model, it says it's a machined 4140 steel receiver. Technically, you can say that something that starts off as an investment casting is machined into final shape. So they could be playing word games, or people have said sometimes they've gone back to the old style forged machined receivers. I don't know. Could call DSA, but you know, first impressions video, initial impressions. Overall, the quality looks good. I will admit, as like I said, FN did castings, but they were all Type 3 receivers, not Type 1. Will that matter? I don't know. On the other hand, this is a semi-auto. FN built many of their guns with expectation of at least select fire. But between the unique features, the lightweight, and the fact that this is not a collectible gun, it could be a good shooter, maybe. So it all comes down to how will it perform at the range. And we'll bring that LMT out, because we need to shoot it too. And that'll be a great control, I think. And I'm sure I'll bring one of the other FALs as well. I'll be interested to see how reliable this mag is, and if it's reliable, how long it lasts. That's probably the part of the gun that I'm not sure about the most, is the thermal mag, but it takes standard, so that's fine. I don't know. People say lots of things about DSA, but I'm a first-hand experience it yourself type person, and this is a good opportunity to do that with a potentially unique FAL variant from a company that's still trying to push it forward. By the way, probably the closest to a military or at least select fire version, and they have had some foreign contracts at DSA. There is the SA58 CTC, Compact Tactical Carbine. There's also the SA58 DMR, which is actually very similar to this, whereas the Carbine usually has the folding stock. The 58 DMR has the fixed stock, and even shows it with the 16-inch fluted barrel. The SPR that they submitted for U.S. military trials a few years back had a very similar barrel, but it was actually 19 inches, and they packed it with a 10-round mag. And also it had an improved grip and trigger and a few other bells and whistles. But yeah, I'd say the closest this might be is what they call the SA58 DMR, perhaps. And those were always semi-auto, even in military use, because of their purpose. Don't know, but it's something unique that came in. I'm a sucker for FALs. I've been wanting a new one, at least a new to me one. Was really holding out, hoping to find a South African R1. Maybe I will one day, but I'm very choosy, very picky on my FALs. So full disclosure, I'm going to be very picky about this gun. If it does anything I don't like, it probably won't be a keeper, even if it runs reliably. When it comes to FALs over the years, I've kind of kept the best ones I can find, at least for the money I want to pay, and sold the rest. So yeah, let's see how this DSA prefix serial receiver holds up, shall we? Hopefully we'll be able to get to that very soon. And like I said at the top of the video, if you'd like to go over onto Patreon, you can vote. Do you want to see the big AR-15 video or the FAL L1A1 video first? Let us know, and we'll oblige next month. And if you own a modern SA58, let us know in the comments your experiences. Sincerely would like to hear. If you could, please also do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and on behalf of everyone else, we'll catch you very soon. Hopefully very soon anyway, if the heat doesn't blast us out next time.